About a 3-hour drive east from San Francisco, nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains, sits a tiny community of ranchers and cabin owners. One of its residents is a loner who spends much of his time harboring sadistic fantasies, as well as fears of the apocalypse. He plans to make his dreams a reality, and documents his process through his journals. With a video camera, still relatively new at the time, he sits down and films the following footage.
Good evening. It's a Sunday in October, 22nd, 23rd, something like that. Very close to my 38th birthday. And I'm starting this tape without script or without any real organization of what I want to say. But I do feel I need to explain. This tape, what you're hearing now, is going to be the lead-in of the various phases of construction of a building, which hopefully will be the first of a series of underground buildings. The main emphasis of the building will be a hidden portion of it, a secret room, if we can call it that, that will house a cell, a jail cell, if you will. The purpose of that cell, and the main purpose, hence, of the building, will be the imprisonment of a young lady. These are very trying times. There are wars and rumors of wars going on. Today, 135 Marines were killed in Leonard. History may be bored. Posterity may care less about this tape. To be honest, I'm not too sure who I want to show this tape to, or if I will ever show it to anyone.
By the time this tape was recorded, this man, Leonard Lake, had already killed at least one person, and in the coming 2 years, he and an accomplice would murder around a dozen more. Leonard Thomas Lake was born on October 29, 1945, in San Francisco, California. He was the first child of Elgin Lake and Gloria Lake, and he would have a younger sister, Sylvia, and brother, Donald. Shortly after Donald's birth, Elgin and Gloria divorced, and Leonard was sent to live with his grandparents. It was under their roof that he would live out the rest of his childhood and adolescence, and in the meantime, Gloria would remarry and have 2 more daughters. At the age of 9, Donald would suffer a severe head injury that left him with some intellectual difficulties. This repulsed Leonard, who began to view Donald as a moron and a drain on society. In his youth, Leonard developed a fixation on pornography, and he would try to dabble in the art itself by photographing his own sisters in the nude. He developed a preoccupation with sex as a whole, and his fantasies grew darker throughout his teens. In May of 1963, The Collector, a novel by John Fowles, was published. The book tells the story of a lonely man who becomes obsessed with a young woman named Miranda and abducts her, keeping her captive in the basement of his home. The woman tries to escape numerous times, but on each occasion she is caught by her captor, who hopes that if he keeps her just for a little bit longer, she will eventually fall in love with him. Leonard read The Collector in his late teens, and was fascinated by its plot. He would later admit in his journals that it served as the main inspiration for his future crimes. Leonard graduated from Balboa High School and subsequently joined the Marines in January of 1964. After basic training, he became a radar technician, and in 1965, he, like many others, was sent to Vietnam. He completed his tour a year later, at which point he was transferred to Point Mugu in California. In 1969, Leonard married his first wife, a woman from Delaware. The next year, he went for a second tour of Vietnam, being stationed in the city of Da Nang. Meanwhile, across the South China Sea, the other half of the Wilseyville Killers was born. Wu Chi-ta, who will hereafter be referred to by his English name Charles Ng, was born on December 24, 1960, in British Hong Kong. That's 2 serial killers born on Christmas Eve. He was the child of Kenneth Ng and Oi Peng Ng, and he had 2 older sisters, Alice and Betty. Charles was a delinquent from an early age, and he developed a habit that would stick with him for the rest of his life: thievery. His father, wanting to keep young Charles in line, dished out beatings to him whenever he misbehaved, but this form of punishment didn't seem to work. At the age of 15, Charles was arrested for shoplifting, and his parents thought that a change of scenery might set him on the right path. As he was well acquainted with the English language, Charles was sent to a grammar school in North Yorkshire, England. He did not last long here, as his penchant for stealing resulted in his expulsion from the school and his return to Hong Kong. It was a disappointment, but his parents decided to try again. In the late 70s, Charles was sent to the United States and attended the College of Notre Dame in the San Francisco Bay Area. This time, instead of being expelled, he dropped out after a single semester. Then, in 1979, Charles accidentally crashed his car into a pole. Fearing prosecution, he decided he needed to get out of the Bay Area quick, so, like Leonard, he enlisted in the Marine Corps. As Charles was technically not a US citizen, he shouldn't have been able to join the army. However, he got recruited by using fake documents that claimed he was born not in Hong Kong, but rather in Indiana.
Can't the courtesy. You're an American now.
He was trained in San Diego and subsequently stationed at Kaneohe Bay in Hawaii. Charles seemed to enjoy his time in the military, as it finally gave him some purpose and discipline. But again, his penchant for theft would lead to his downfall. In November of 1981, he was arrested for stealing over $10,000 worth of weapons from an armory on the base. He managed to escape custody and fled back to California. A decade earlier, Leonard also had some troubles in the military. In comparison with his first tour, where he enjoyed his time in country, something had changed with this one. In 1971, after suffering a mental breakdown, he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder and was discharged from the army. As the relationship between Leonard and his wife progressed, he became increasingly controlling. Eventually, their marriage broke off altogether. Distraught by this divorce, Leonard wasn't really sure what to do next. He briefly became involved with the hippie scene in San Francisco before finding his home for the next several years. It was a remote property situated in the northern coast mountains near the town of Ukiah, California. It was during his period living here that his interest in survivalism grew. Against the local rules, he collected a cache of weapons, built a shooting range to practice the skills he'd learned in the army, and began constructing an underground bunker in preparation for doomsday. Other people on the ranch were creeped out by Leonard, and it was no secret that he was a bit of a pervert, but they were used to strange characters living in the area. One such person was the notorious Oberon Zell Ravenheart, or as he was known back then, Otter Zell. He was a neo-paganist leader known for having patented a method of giving goats unicorn horns. The most well-known of these goats was Sir Lancelot, who was included in a traveling circus. At some point, Otter became acquainted with Leonard Lake, and he allowed him to pet Sir Lancelot, leading to this bizarre photo. It's been claimed that Leonard used the goat to lure in young women for nude photos, but I can't find many sources to corroborate that. Around 1980, Leonard met a woman named Clarilyn Balaz, a teaching assistant from San Francisco. The two began dating, and by the next year, they were married. They shortly thereafter moved to the tiny community of Philo, about 25 minutes from Ukiah. The relationship was smooth, with Clarilyn being much more conducive to Leonard's controlling nature than his previous wife. It is believed by many then that she was a willing participant in his later crimes, though this is not confirmed. However, there was one other person that Leonard would meet in late 1981, and this individual would become his true partner in crime. Charles Ng maintained a low profile so he wouldn't be sent to a military prison, and he needed a place to stay. One of his comrades at Kaneohe Bay had told him about a guy named Leonard living in Mendocino County, California. So, Charles contacted Leonard, and the two met in December of 1981, just a few weeks after his escape from custody. At the time, Leonard was managing a motel in Philo, and he provided a room for Charles on the agreement that he would act as his assistant. It was here where Charles would spend the next few months, and he and Leonard would have a shared interest in survivalism. Meanwhile, two government agencies had been keeping a close eye on the duo. One was the ATF, who focused on Leonard, believing he possessed illegal weapons. The other was the FBI, who received a tip stating that Charles had fled to Philo. They began surveilling the motel in which the two resided, and on April 29, 1982, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng were arrested. Clarelyn bailed Leonard out of the Mendocino County Jail, and he subsequently fled, becoming a fugitive. Charles, meanwhile, was taken to Hawaii to face prosecution for stealing from the armory. There, he was sentenced to 18 months, which he would serve at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Leavenworth, Kansas. There is little of note during Charles's time in prison. He made a few friends and remained in contact with Leonard via mail. It's quite likely that he became acquainted with a guy named Michael Carroll, who also happened to be from San Francisco. He will make an appearance later. Charles Ng was released from Fort Leavenworth on June 29, 1984. He traveled back to California to reunite with Leonard, and the two caught up on what had happened over the last 2 years. After Clarelyn bailed Leonard out of jail, she decided she could no longer be in a committed relationship with him. The two divorced in November of 1982, but they would remain on good terms. Exemplifying this fact, Clarelyn offered to let Leonard live in a cabin that belonged to her father. It was located in Wilseyville, about 5 hours away from Philo, in Calaveras County. The isolation of the place was much to Leonard's liking. It was here where he would continue to live for the next 3 years, and it was here where he would begin his killing spree. When the following incident took place is unknown, but it is generally agreed that it occurred in December of 1982. Leonard made a surprise visit to his family's San Francisco home. He offered to bring his brother, Donald, on a road trip. This was quite an unusual move for Leonard, because as far as everyone else knew, his hatred for his intellectually challenged sibling lingered. However, Donald gladly accepted his offer, and the two were on their way. Donald Lake was never seen or heard from again. Their mother, concerned for them, reported both Donald and Leonard missing, but Leonard would reappear in San Francisco after just a few days. Though Leonard most likely killed his brother, this has never been proven. If there was a motive for doing so, Leonard likely did it to collect checks that Donald was receiving from the government. In 1983, Leonard began keeping a detailed journal of his day-to-day life. He confessed to his fantasies and his plans for the future. One entry reveals that the John Fowles book he had read decades prior was still ever present in his mind. He writes, "Ah, the collector. Has it really been near 20 years I've carried this fantasy? And Miranda, how fitting, my lovely little prisoner of the future. I suppose in my way I am the same wimp as the hero, and in my way just as crazy. I have no doubt that we wimps have been compensating for our inabilities since the dawn of history. Sad, really. Still, how can we die if we never live?" Huh? In April, Leonard began planning his second murder. The target on this occasion was a man named Charles Gunner. Charles was a longtime friend of Leonard's, and served as the best man at his and Clarelyn's wedding. As Charles was also receiving government checks, Leonard saw this as an opportunity to make more money as well as steal his identity. On May 22, 1983, Leonard offered to bring Charles on a 2-week vacation and left his daughters in the care of a babysitter. Before leaving, Leonard mentioned to the babysitter that they would either go to Las Vegas or Lake Tahoe. In reality, they went to neither, and Leonard killed Charles Gunner, burying him on the Wilseyville property. On May 24th, Leonard went back to Charles's house and informed the babysitter that he had eloped with a woman he met while they were on vacation. Leonard gave the daughters some false optimism that their father may return someday, then drove away in Charles's car. Thanks to the money that was meant for Donald Lake and Charles Gunner, Leonard now had the funds to carry out what he dubbed Operation Miranda. The plan involved constructing a bunker that would protect him from the apocalypse and house his personal sex slave.
I'm a realist. I'm 38 years old, a bit chubby, not much hair, and losing what I have. I've gone through 2 divorces, innumerable women. I'm afraid a bottom line statement is the simple fact that I'm a sexist slob. I enjoy using women, and of course women aren't particularly interested in being used. What I want is an off-the-shelf sex partner. I want to be able to use a woman whenever and however I want. And when I'm tired or satiated or bored or not interested, I simply want to put her away, lock her up in a little room, get her out of my sight, out of my life. Life, as I'm living it, is boring. The challenge of this project, the excitement, the thrill if it succeeds, we'll see.
The bunker was to be built into the side of a hill next to Leonard's cabin. Construction officially began in late 1983.
So, here it is. Backhoe worked for 24 hours. Myself and 2 young men with our little picks and shovels and wheelbarrows worked for another 3 or 4 days. Little dog chasing a butterfly. The next scene you see will probably be the concrete trucks pouring the concrete in the footing. And then we start to build. I can hardly wait.
Over the coming months, the bricks were laid and the rooms laid out, including the secret cell where Leonard would house his captive. By the summer of 1984, with the bunker mostly complete, he set about looking for a suitable victim. He rented an apartment in San Francisco where he believed he'd have an easier time finding prey. And with Charles now in Leonard's company, the two would carry out some of Northern California's most heinous crimes. "30-year-old Harvey Dubbs and his wife, 33-year-old Deborah, lived in San Francisco with their 1-year-old son, Sean. They had some video equipment that they wanted to either sell or rent, and they placed an ad in the newspaper for it. 2 customers eventually called in, and they met with the Dubbs at their apartment on the afternoon of July 25th, 1984. That evening, as it got dark, a neighbor looked out their window at the Dubbs' home. They witnessed 2 men exiting the apartment building, one Asian and another white. The Asian man was carrying a large duffel bag. He loaded it into the trunk of the Dubbs' car, and the 2 drove away. The following day, Harvey failed to report for work. A friend of the Dubbses went to check up on them and let themselves into the apartment. Harvey, Deborah, Sean, and the camera had vanished. On July 27th, 2 days after the Dubbs disappeared, 2 men were again seen exiting the apartment with a duffel bag. A neighbor tried to confront them, but they quickly drove away. The Dubbs family was officially reported missing, and news spread through San Francisco about the family's sudden disappearance. Meanwhile, at the Wilseyville cabin, Leonard and Charles disposed of the bodies of 30-year-old Harvey and 1-year-old Sean. It's likely that they proceeded to use the camera equipment they had stolen to film themselves abusing Deborah before killing her too, but sources conflict on this fact. October of 1984. In the Fillmore district of San Francisco was the Pink Palace housing project. Among its residents were 35-year-old Randy Jacobson, 38-year-old Maurice Rock, and 26-year-old Cheryl Okoro. Randy was acquainted with a man he knew only by the pseudonym Alan Dre. Maurice and Cheryl were later introduced to Alan, and Alan offered to take all 3 to his cabin on various pretenses. Neither Randy, nor Maurice, nor Cheryl were ever seen alive again. On October 15th, Alan Dre, or rather Leonard Lake, documented their murders in his journal, referring to the victims with code names. His likely reason for killing the trio was to collect their social security checks. The following day, Charles was arrested for shoplifting in Daly City and was soon after bailed out by Clarelyn Balaz. Charles was becoming a problem for Leonard. If he kept up his stealing antics, it could sabotage their entire operation, but for the time being, things were fine for the duo. Another disappearance would occur just a few weeks later. 39-year-old Paul Cosner worked as a car dealer in San Francisco. He had a 1980 Honda Prelude that he was wanting to sell, and like Harvey Dubbs, took to advertising it in the local papers. A man responded to the ad, and from a test drive with him, Paul deduced the man as creepy. He left to meet the buyer again on the evening of November 2nd, 1984, to make the official transaction, and he told his girlfriend he would return by 8 p.m. According to Leonard's journal, he and Charles, quote, met resistance when they killed Paul, meaning Paul likely fought back. Leonard and Charles apparently took a liking to Paul's Honda Prelude, and it would serve as the main vehicle for the rest of their crime spree. The next 2 victims were taken from the same place. In September of 1984, Charles Zing began working at a moving company in San Francisco. He became acquainted with 2 co-workers, 23-year-old Clifford Parenteau and 25-year-old Jeffrey Gerald. According to employees, Charles and Cliff had frequent disputes with each other while on the job. Cliff's frustrations were shared by other co-workers, who generally regarded Charles as strange and rejected any offers he made to take them to a cabin he supposedly owned. January of 1985. San Franciscans prepared for the upcoming Super Bowl XIX, which was to be a match between the 49ers and the Miami Dolphins. Employees at the moving company began placing bets on how the game would unfold.
Bill Walsh had a great defensive area. Super Bowl XIX is in the record book.
On the night of January 20th, celebration was abound as the 49ers crushed the Dolphins, and the winning bet at the moving company was from Clifford Parenteau. However, he was not present to watch the game with his coworkers. In fact, nobody had seen him at all that weekend, and the jackpot went unclaimed. Several days later, an employee at the moving company received a letter claiming to be from Cliff. The writer said he found a new job and moved away. He told the employee to send the prize money to a cabin in Wilseyville, so they did. The next month saw the disappearance of another employee at the company. On February 24th, 1985, Jeff Gerald called his roommate to tell her that he would be helping a coworker, Charles Zing, move some furniture into a new place. He did not return to his apartment that night. Unfortunately, Jeff's disappearance is not well documented, and what specifically Leonard and Charles did to him is unknown. The following 6 murders would occur over the course of a single week, roughly. 23-year-old Michael Carroll had been released from the Leavenworth Penitentiary, the place where he met Charles Zing, and he began dating an 18-year-old named Kathleen Allen. The two were renting out a motel room in Milpitas, California, at least until they could find something better. On the night of April 12, 1985, during a visit with a friend, Mike abruptly announced that he needed to leave and promised to return home the next morning. The following day, the 13th, passed with no word from Mike. On the 14th, Kathleen received a call at her workplace. The man on the other end informed her that Michael had been involved in a terrible accident near Lake Tahoe. He told her he would pick her up from her place of work and take her to see Michael. Kathleen left her shift early and was picked up by a man driving a Honda Prelude. It was a long trip to Lake Tahoe, so the man suggested they stop at a motel for the night. In the room, the man tried to convince Kathleen that he was a professional photographer and that he wanted to take pictures of her. In a moment alone, Kathy called up one of her friends and told him about the whole ordeal with Mike and how the man who was taking her to Lake Tahoe was beginning to creep her out. Kathy promised to call again soon, and she hung up. Kathleen woke up in a strange place. It was a tiny cell-like room with only a slab of wood for a bed. Taped to one of the walls was a sheet of paper that read, in part, Rules. 1. I must always be ready to service my master. 2. I must never speak unless spoken to. 3. I must never show my disrespect, either verbally or silent. 4. I must be obedient completely and in all things. 5. I must always be quiet when locked in my cell. 6. I must remember and obey any additional rules told to me. Kathy began kicking on what appeared to be the door. It wouldn't budge, and there was no other escape. Sometime later, the door to the cell opened. Leonard Lake brought her from the bunker to the cabin, where he forced her to make a phone call to her boss. In the call, she stated that she and Michael had found work in Lake Tahoe and were going to be there indefinitely. Leonard Lake and Charles Zing subsequently grabbed the camera they had stolen from Harvey Dubbs and began filming Kathleen.
If you go along with this, cooperate with this, we'll be as nice as we can to you within the limits of keeping you prisoner. If you don't go along with this, we'll probably take you into the bed, tie you down, rape you, shoot you, and bury you. So, my lady, time's up. Make your choice.
But I want to be available.
That's all we wanted to hear. While you're here, we'll keep you busy. You'll wash for us, you'll clean for us, cook for us, you'll cook for us. That's your choice in a nutshell. It's not much of a choice. Unless you've got a death wish.
No, I don't check that.
Leonard brought Kathy into his room, taking more pictures and videos of her.
If it ever arises again, if there's any circumstance whatsoever that leads me to think that you're even attempting to make noise, it's immaterial as to whether I hear you or anyone else hears you. You will be whipped very severely. Now tell me you understand.
I understand.
Kathleen Allen was kept captive for an unknown amount of time, likely a few days, before she was killed. Meanwhile, the next-door neighbors up the hill were beginning to get on Leonard's nerves. They were the Bond family, composed of 27-year-old Lonnie Bond, 20-year-old Brenda O'Connor, and their 2-year-old son, Lonnie Bond Jr., and they had moved in just a few months ago. They attempted to make friends with Leonard Lake, who called himself Charles Gunner, but he made them quite uncomfortable. Leonard took a liking to Brenda and frequently tried making advances on her. As a result, Brenda would always try to put as much distance as she could between him and her. On April 19, 1985, around the time that Kathleen Allen had been killed, a friend of the Bonds, 26-year-old Robin Scott Stapley, was staying with them in Wilseyville. It's believed that at some point in the night, a confrontation occurred between Lonnie and Leonard, possibly as a result of him shooting guns near their property, or him making more unwanted advances on Brenda. Whatever the events of that night were, it angered Leonard enough that he grabbed a gun and forced his way into the Bonds' cabin. There, he gagged Lonnie and Scott, then shot them both in the head. He then bludgeoned Lonnie Jr. to death while he was sleeping in a crib. After committing this massacre, he kidnapped Brenda and escorted her to his property. She would suffer an ordeal similar to Kathleen's.
Why are you doing this?
Because we hate you. Your baby is going to be taken away. Excuse me.
How many did be taken away?
There's a family down in Fresno that doesn't have a baby. Her baby is sound asleep, like a rock. We don't like you. Would you like me to put it in writing?
It's done. Just stick it whatever we tell you.
I'm going to pass out if it's at night or something.
Well, you can pass out, but we won't wake you up.
I don't think that's how that works.
Miranda, I have a lot of animosity against you, and I would just as soon start you out with a nice firm whipping right now to make you believe how serious we are.
Brenda was likely sexually assaulted, and she wasn't kept alive for long. On the morning of April 23rd, Charles Zing and Leonard Lake took Scott Stapley's truck for a drive. They ended up colliding with an 18-wheeler about 25 miles south of Bakersfield, California. A highway patrol officer who responded to the accident noticed a large duffel bag in Stapley's truck, but didn't see anything else suspicious, so the two were free to leave. In early May, Kathleen Allen's employer received one last correspondence regarding her. It was a letter requesting that her final paycheck be mailed to a particular location, so the employer granted this request and mailed her check to an address in Wilseyville. On Sunday, June 2nd, 1985, Leonard Lake and Charles Zing went to San Francisco to get materials for a project. They arrived at a place called South City Lumber and Supply in South San Francisco. While inside, Charles happened upon a vise which looked like it could be useful. He grabbed it, and as had happened many times before, his instinct told him to steal it. So, Charles made his way to the exit and walked toward his car. Unbeknownst to him, he had just initiated his and Leonard's downfall. The store clerks, who witnessed him shoplift the vise, went outside to confront him, but Charles ran away upon noticing them. The employees then surrounded the car he had been approaching, a Honda Prelude. The trunk was open, and inside it was the vise. They retrieved it, and the police were then called to the scene. An officer arrived and searched the car. Inside a backpack, he discovered a handgun with an illegal silencer affixed to it. Leonard realized that Charles had run off, so he approached the officer and tried to explain the situation, offering to pay for the vise himself. When the officer asked who he was, he introduced himself as Robin Scott Stapley and handed over an ID. The officer noticed the picture on the license didn't very much resemble the man he was talking to. Other things weren't adding up. If his name was Scott Stapley, then why did his license plate belong to one Lonnie Bond and his car to one Paul Cosner? The policeman then returned his attention to the handgun and placed Leonard Lake under arrest for having an illegally modified weapon. In the time that elapsed during this interaction, Charles had paid a visit to Clairlyn Balaz's apartment and told her he needed to leave San Francisco immediately. On the way to the airport, the two swung by the hardware store. They drove away when they observed that Leonard had been placed in handcuffs. Leonard was taken to the police station. They sat him down in the interrogation room, and after some grilling, Leonard asked for something to write on and some time alone. Leonard proceeded to write a note addressed to Clairlyn. It read, "Dear Lynn, I love you. I forgive you. Freedom is better than all else. Tell Janet I'm sorry. Mom, Patty, and all. I'm sorry for all the trouble. Love, Leonard." He then reached into a secret compartment in his shirt containing a cyanide pill and swallowed it. When the investigators returned to the interrogation room, Leonard was seizing on the floor. He was rushed to a nearby hospital. The cyanide pill, which was several years old, was weak, and thus it did not kill Leonard immediately. He remained comatose for 4 days. With Leonard unresponsive and Charles a fugitive, the only person police had to talk to was Clairlyn. They spoke with her and mentioned that in their investigation, they learned that Leonard had a property in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Clairlyn and the police agreed to meet up there the following day. At around 10 a.m. the next morning, detectives from San Francisco and Calaveras County met up with Clairlyn and Leonard Lake's mother, Gloria, at the Wilseyville cabin. They looked through the home, making note of a number of objects that reminded them of previous missing person investigations, in particular a video camera. A quick run of the serial numbers would confirm that it belonged to none other than the missing Harvey Dubbs. Investigators were also interested in checking out the bunker sitting near the cabin, but Clairlyn denied them entry. The police eventually left. The discovery of Harvey's camera meant that when the investigators returned to the property, they would have ample cause for a search warrant. The bunker was searched. Most of what was inside seemed innocuous, like various construction tools, but pinned to one wall was a creepy array of pictures depicting young women whom Leonard had photographed. These women would later be identified by police, and luckily they were alive and well. Detectives scanned the room. Their eyes landed upon what appeared to be door hinges peeking out from behind a shelf. They pulled open the secret door, which led into a cramped bedroom. On one wall, they discovered another door, the hinges of which had been damaged, as though someone on the other side had pushed hard on it. They opened the door to make a disturbing discovery. This was the cell where Leonard kept his prisoners, a claustrophobic 3x6 compartment with barely any necessities.
Inside that room there was a makeshift bed that had a small mattress on it and some blankets. There was toilet paper in there, personal effects for a female such as makeup, and also a small plastic bucket used as a toilet, we believe.
Any hope of Leonard Lake explaining himself evaporated when he finally succumbed to cyanide poisoning on June 6 at the age of 39. Charles had boarded a flight from San Francisco to Chicago. There, he met up with an acquaintance who drove him from Chicago to Detroit, with Charles crossing the Ambassador Bridge into Ontario, Canada. His exact movements during the following month are uncertain, but he generally made his way toward Western Canada. Meanwhile, as the search intensified, Clairlyn Balaz cooperated with investigators and handed them potential evidence. The police returned to Wilseyville. They ran the license plates on a sedan and a pickup in the driveway. They belonged to Lonnie Bond and Scott Stapley, respectively. Around the property were what appeared to be several burial sites and burn sites. They would be excavated in the coming weeks, and Calaveras County would live up to its name. That one's for my Spanish-speaking viewers. The first trench to be dug up held a bucket that contained Leonard Lake's journal and 2 VHS tapes. One was labeled M, which was the tape of Leonard's monologue and the construction of the bunker. The other, titled M Ladies, Kathy/Brenda, was a compilation of both Kathleen Allen's and Brenda O'Connor's abuse. As the property continued to be scavenged, police discovered numerous containers filled with personal items from the victims. They included driver's licenses, jewelry, Paul Cosner's glasses, Jeffrey Gerald's camera, and Clifford Parenteau's sweater. A .22 caliber pistol, used to kill at least one of the victims, was also discovered. A few officers searched the Bond cabin next door. Nobody had seen them in almost 2 months. The stench of uneaten food emanated from the fridge, and faint traces of blood did all but confirm foul play. Cadaver dogs were brought to Leonard's property, and police would begin to unearth bodies. The first shallow grave was discovered along one side of the cabin. It held the bodies of 2 apparently African-American men, one of whom was identified as Maurice Rock. The other remains unidentified to this day. Another lime-covered body was found next to a chicken coop, identified as Randy Jacobson. In one grave, police found only a couple small bones. DNA testing would later show that these belonged to Cheryl Okoro. Tooth fragments were a possible match to the dental records of Kathleen Allen and Brenda O'Connor. A trench was discovered next to the road that leads to the house. In it, police uncovered the bodies of Lonnie Bond and Scott Stapley. In addition to all of these remains, investigators had managed to collect bone fragments from all over the property, totaling some 40 pounds. While it's impossible to determine how many bodies these belonged to, the police estimated that they could be from as many as 20 additional victims.
Up until this point, we've really relied on our imaginations to visualize this story. But today we have pictures that will probably leave many people with an everlasting image of the horror that occurred at the end of this road. These are some of the bone fragments that have been found, and investigators say there are countless fragments just like those scattered over a third of an acre here. The California Conservation Corps has been recruited to pick up the bones. Most of them worked on their hands and knees, raking the ground with their fingers. Investigators came up with 10 pounds of bones. The local coroner says 5 bodies have been found here so far. The Calaveras County Sheriff once told me, though, he believes there are as many as 20 victims, though, buried on the property.
Simultaneous to the search for evidence was the search for Charles Ng. The FBI was keeping an eye out for Charles Ng in Chicago when they received word that he may have fled to Canada. It was known that Charles had a relative who lived in Calgary, so that might be where he was headed. On or around June 24, 1985, about 3 weeks after Charles initially fled, a teenager was biking through Fish Creek Provincial Park on Calgary's south end. He spotted what appeared to be a lean-to in the woods and walked toward it out of curiosity. As he approached, a face suddenly emerged from underneath the leaves and wood and shooed the teen away. The teen informed his parents, who informed the police. An officer went to inspect the makeshift campsite, but the man was nowhere to be found. 2 weeks later, on July 6, a couple security guards were on duty at a Hudson's Bay store in downtown Calgary. They spotted an Asian man attempting to shoplift a couple items and confronted him as he exited the store. One of the guards, Sean Doyle, grabbed a hold of him and brought him back inside. They asked him for an ID. Charles whipped out a .22 caliber pistol he'd been carrying with him, and a struggle ensued. The guards kicked Charles to the ground and tried to wrestle the gun away from him. A shot was accidentally fired into the ceiling. Charles bit Sean as another shot went off, piercing Sean's left hand. They managed to get the gun away from him, and the police took Charles into custody. The news of Charles Ng's arrest was met with much celebration. Hearing of his detainment, American authorities began pleading with Canadian authorities to have Charles extradited back to California. This would last for several years. 5 months after his arrest, in December of 1985, Charles went to trial in Calgary for the shoplifting incident. He was found guilty of assault with a weapon and was sentenced to 4.5 years, beginning his prison career at Edmonton Institution. During his time here, Charles would befriend a fellow inmate named Maurice LaBerge. Though Charles avoided talking about the killings with police, his time in prison showed he was more than willing with Maurice. Throughout 1986, Maurice secretly wrote down all the things that Charles told him. He planned on snitching so as to possibly have his own prison sentence reduced. Charles, in attempts at humor, would make crude drawings depicting the killings and would pass them over to Maurice's cell. These, along with his notes, were later given to the authorities. The legal battle to have Charles extradited to the United States continued. Realistically, the Canadian government would have been more than willing to get rid of this fugitive as soon as they could, as the US and Canada have an extradition treaty. However, if Charles was convicted of the murders in California, he would most likely be handed the death penalty, which the Canadian government did not support. However, they relented. On September 26, 1991, 6 years after the killings came to light, the Supreme Court of Canada voted 4-3 to extradite Charles Ng back to the United States so he could face trial. Meanwhile, the property in Wilseyville sat abandoned. The bunker had been destroyed after the investigation ended. Clara Lynn Balazs wanted to sell the cabin, and she did so in 1990. In September of 1992, the man who took over the property wanted to build a new garage. While he was digging to put in the foundations, he managed to uncover yet another body. It was identified as Charles Gunner, one of Leonard Lake's first victims.
Months after investigators had cleared out, Reg Jaime found another body as he was digging down to install a footing for a new garage.
This is where the body was located, was right here, below.
This is the one you found?
Right.
How far down?
Maybe 3 to 4 feet.
3 to 4 feet.
Jaime's discovery has led some to believe that there could be many more bodies buried here.
Almost immediately after the Canadian Supreme Court's ruling in 1991, Charles Ng was on a flight back to California, where he would be housed at Folsom State Prison. He was charged with 12 counts of murder. The next 7 years would be a legal nightmare for everyone involved, because during his time in prison, Charles read extensively on the law and discovered many ways to delay his trial for as long as he possibly could. Charles was given 2 court-appointed lawyers. He attempted to fire them, but was denied. He then tried to sue these lawyers for malpractice. Fearing that he might try to escape the courtroom, Charles was kept locked up inside a metal cage during breaks. In 1994, a judge from Siskiyou County moved the trial to Orange County, California. He was given a new set of lawyers, who he fired. He later tried to rehire them, and his request was granted. He then tried to fire them again so he could represent himself, which was not granted, and this team of lawyers would go on to represent him for the official trial. By now, you can imagine the frustration within not only the prosecutors, but also the families of the victims. As Charles was running out of delay tactics, and gaining weight from years in jail, prosecutors planned on calling 2 notable people to testify at his impending trial. The first was his Edmonton prison buddy, Maurice LeBerge. However, this plan was cancelled in May of 1998 after Maurice died in a car crash in rural Alberta. The other person was Clara Lynn Balazs. In exchange for her testimony, she was granted complete immunity from the law. This was a controversial decision, as many viewed her as suspicious and thought it was likely she had some involvement in the killings. On October 26, 1998, a whopping 13 years since the crimes came to light, Charles Ng's trial for the murder of 12 people finally commenced. His defense attorney, Bill Kelly, made the argument that all the murders had been committed by Leonard Lake and Charles was merely under his control. The prosecutors made the argument that even if Charles wasn't the one to deliver the final blow to the victims, he is still just as guilty of murder as Leonard is. Charles made repeated verbal outbursts at the judge, and he was pulled aside so that a stun belt could be placed on his back. If he shouted again, the deputy would deliver an electric shock to him. The tapes of Kathleen Allen and Brenda O'Connor were shown to the jury. They clearly showed that they'd been filmed at the cabin, and at certain points, Charles could be seen in frame. The evidence connecting him to each victim was explained one by one over the coming months, which included some of the drawings made by Charles. On January 6, 1999, Clara Lynn Balazs came to the stand to testify. However, before she could say anything, Charles's attorney, Bill, dismissed her in a move that stunned everyone. Perhaps Bill believed that if he asked Clara Lynn any questions, she might say something that would incriminate his client. On February 23, 1999, after 2 weeks of deliberation, Charles Ng was found guilty on all 12 counts. Except for one. The jury could not agree if the evidence pointed to Charles as being the killer of Paul Cosner. This came as a devastating blow to Paul's relatives, but nonetheless, Charles was a convicted man now, and everyone patiently awaited his sentencing. On April 20th, while most of the US focused on the horrors that happened at a Colorado high school, a few turned their attention towards Charles Ng's father, Kenneth Ng, who took the stand. He admitted that he punished Charles harshly as a kid, and felt extreme remorse for this, blaming himself for turning his son into a killer. Charles's mother testified after him and explained how the case had tarnished their family's image and relationship with her son. Both Kenneth and Oiping pleaded for their son to be spared the death penalty. Though the jury was undoubtedly moved by their testimonies, it was not enough to save his life. On June 30th, 1999, after 14 years of legal hiccups and an outrageous cost totaling millions of dollars, Charles Ng was sentenced to death.
The judge has upheld the death penalty, and now I am satisfied that he is going to have to pay for my son's murder. But closure, never, ever will there be closure. There cannot be closure. My son is dead. How can I have closure from that?
Another 15 probably before he gets a death sentence, but we'll be there. My mom probably won't be here, but we will. We'll be there when they kill him.
After the trial, Clairlyn Balaz changed her name, and she continues to live a quiet life in Northern California. In 2011, a person believed to be her was arrested for embezzlement. Other than that, there are no recent records or sightings of her. In 2021, some of the unidentified remains found at Leonard Lake's property, which had been buried in a tomb in San Andreas, California, were exhumed. It is hoped that they can be identified via a genealogy database, though there are apparently no results thus far. The case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng is one that remains relatively obscure despite how bizarre and horrific it is. As of the making of this video, Charles Ng, now in his 60s, is still on death row at San Quentin State Prison. The last execution to take place in California occurred in 2006. The remaining relatives of the victims continue to wait for the day he is finally put down. This was one of the most difficult cases for me to research because of how often sources conflicted with each other. Exemplifying this is the fact that there is seemingly no consensus on how many people Leonard Lake and Charles Ng killed. The most commonly reported death toll is 11, as this is the number of convictions Charles received. However, that doesn't include all the victims killed by Leonard alone, or other potential victims connected to the case. Often, the number is inflated to 25, as this is the estimate the police gave when taking into account all the bone fragments. I personally believe the death toll to be between 17 and 21, with a likely total of 18. There are the 11 convictions. On top of that, there are 5 other confirmed victims: Charles Gunner, Randy Jacobson, Maurice Rock, Cheryl Okoro, and Paul Cosner. There's also the extra unidentified body that was found at the property, thus making the minimum of 17. Though Donald Lake was never confirmed to be killed by Leonard, it's pretty safe to say he was, as he was last seen with him and there was a very good financial motive for Leonard to do so. So that's 18 likely victims. There are 3 other possible victims. On July 11th, 1984, a couple weeks before the Dubs' disappearance, 36-year-old Donald Giulietti and Richard Carrazza were shot in their San Francisco apartment after a man responded to an ad they placed. Donald died from his injuries. Richard survived and testified that the person who shot them was a slender Asian man with glasses. They'd been shot with a .22 caliber pistol, like the one found at Leonard Lake's cabin. In a lineup, Richard was fairly certain that the man who shot him was Charles Ng, but Charles himself denied involvement. In 1994, evidence that could tie Leonard and Charles to Donald Giulietti's death was accidentally destroyed by investigators. In April of 1984, a 30-year-old named Jeffrey Askren disappeared from Sunnyvale, California. In early May, his car was found abandoned near the small town of West Point, about 4 miles from Leonard's cabin. Jeffrey is considered a possible victim of Leonard's, but as far as I know, there's no other evidence linking him to the case. During the search at the property, among all the scattered remains, police found a small piece of a human liver that had been burned. Medical experts analyzed it and tentatively concluded that it was a child's liver, possibly between the ages of 3 and 7. Later, DNA analysis would show that it belonged to neither Sean Dubs nor Lonnie Bond Jr. It's possible that at least one other child was killed by Leonard and Charles, but there are no other cases of missing children that can be connected to the murders. So where are the rest of the victims buried? Likely a fair distance from the cabin. The grave containing Lonnie Bond and Scott Stapley was discovered half a mile away from the property, and was only noticed because it was on the side of a road in a spot where the dirt had clearly been disturbed. Clearland Balaz's culpability in the killings is often brought up when discussing this case. According to the book Die For Me by Dawn Lasseter, which I sourced heavily for this video, she admitted to knowing some of Leonard's plans to abduct victims but claimed to have no involvement in the actual crimes. Several investigators will attest to the fact that she seemed to know more than she was letting on. It is often said that Charles Ng's trial was the most expensive in California's history. This is quite a dubious claim, but one that is hard to debunk, since nobody seems to know how much it actually cost. According to Encyclopedia.com, the cost was $6.6 million. According to the Stockton Record, it was $10.8 million. According to Dawn Lasseter, it was $20 million. These are only estimates, though. It is generally agreed that the most expensive trial in California was not Charles Ng's trial, but rather the McMartin preschool trial. Sharon Salido, the sister of Paul Cosner, continues to tell her story, and she has become a victims' rights advocate. She holds out hope that one day, the body of her brother will finally be found. A recent development in this case involves victim Cheryl Okoro. After many years of searching, a woman in Michigan named Cheryl Gyant discovered that Cheryl Okoro was her biological mother. Such is the basis of Cheryl Gyant's book, A Letter from Sherry, which offers a unique, though largely fictionalized perspective on this case.